Welcome to Optimal Insights, your weekly source for real-time rate data and expert capital markets commentary, brought to you by Optimal Blue. Let's dive in and help you maximize your profitability this week.
Welcome to Optimal Insights, your weekly source for timely market analysis and expert commentary from Optimal Blue. I'm Jeff McCarty, Vice President of Product Management at Optimal Blue. As you may notice, Jim Glennon's not here today, but joining me are Kevin Foley, Director of Product Management, and Alex Hebner, our resident economic guru from the desk. Let's dive into today's episode. All right. Welcome, Alex and Kevin. See if we can have a great show. Even without Jim, I think we got a lot of interesting things to talk about today. As always, we'll see where we're at with the market. We'll try to move a little bit away from tariff talks today, but of course it's unavoidable. We've got to hit on some of that. I think the big news over the past several days is the Trump-Powell tiff, if you will. We'll call it a tiff for now. We'll get into some of the details of that. But overall, it was kind of a stable week last week in terms of data, and in terms of where the markets were. We saw the OBMMI pretty stable in a pretty narrow range. So the conforming 30-year is 6.7, sort of bouncing around that 6.7, 6.8 range. Same story with the 10-year, really kind of 4.35 all week. So relatively flat there. Last week, the yield curve, looking at the 210 yield curve, that was flat, but it had kind of steepened the week prior as we saw a little bit of a run up in rates. So that 210 yield curve is about as steep as we've seen it in a while, a good while. So over 50 basis points. So we can hit on that a little bit as well. Last thing is lock volume. As we're looking at lock volume across all of our clients, we've seen that hang in there. In spite of the jump in rates, I think it's, surprisingly strong lock volume relative to where we are with rates. So maybe we start with that, talking about what we're seeing in terms of lock volume. Anything particularly interesting you want to comment on there?
Yeah, I think I'll speak, I don't want to speak for the entirety of the Denver desk, but I think anecdotally what I can speak to is in line with the broad numbers you're seeing for the lock volume in our system, Jeff. Last week, a lot of my clients saw steady volume throughout the week, despite, rates having ratcheted back up on the back of this 210 spread that you're talking about here, the long end of the curve, 10-year plus, all seeing higher rates, a bit of I don't want to call it dumping, a lot of selling activity in the treasuries market right now. That being said, I would say mortgages have held up pretty well. I think we're definitely seeing a bit of seasonality in effect. This is prime spring buying season to get yourself in a new home in the early summer. And I mean, if you look back over the course of a year, on the OBMMI, we're a quarter to 3/8 better than we were this time last year. So I think a lot of people are locking and they can say, hey, I'm getting a better deal than I would have this time last year. And I think there's a lot less convincing that needs to be done in regards to rates, just because people become accustomed to this rate environment.
Yeah, I think those are some good points. I also noticed Logan Motoshami had posted an article in Housing Wire talking about new home sale data. The weekly data that they track is showing positive year-over-year growth. Obviously that's a good thing, and I think speaks to, Alex, what you're saying, which is we're sort of here. Rates have been elevated. Maybe there was a contingent out there somewhere who was expecting that, home prices would drop dramatically because of the lack of demand. That really hasn't happened over the past couple of years. And in fact, some corners of the country are still very strong and significantly lower inventory than pre-pandemic. So, overall, I do think it's reflective of people are just sort of getting used to, the market the way that it is, and just making the most important decision of their lives, kind of regardless of, what things are going on out there.
I think a last point that I could make in regards to, what we're talking about here in the mortgage market is that we have seen some of the hottest markets cool a little bit. I know that the Austin, Texas of the world, the Denver, Colorados, they've all seen increased time on the market for homes, and they've also seen cuts in housing prices. So I think, a combined factor of, pricing is a little bit better in some of the hottest spots in the country. In addition to, again, if you're just looking at, if you felt like you might have given up your opportunity last spring, you could be getting into a better rate right now.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
All right, well, let's get into our the never-ending topic. Let's talk about where we are at the state of tariffs right now over the past week. What kind of talk there's been over the weekend? Anything interesting there?
Yeah, I'll keep it pretty short because I think this news update regarding tariffs is actually pretty short this time around. We really didn't see much development in the tariff realm last week. Right now, just as a reminder, there's a 10% blanket tariff, on pretty much every country in the world. There's 25% tariffs on sector-specific carve-outs that the Trump administration has already built out, specifically in metals, I believe in lumber, and then in auto parts. They've made announcements that there's going to be further sector-specific carve-outs for tariffs to try and, emphasize trade deals on certain products before others. And then we have the 145% tariff on China. I don't think that one's really a shocker to anyone. I've seen calls of people being like, why aren't we just embargoing them at this point? Because that number is already essentially an embargo tariff. I think there's a whole conversation that could be had there. But that's kind of the lay of the land where tariffs are at. I think people were expecting over the weekend maybe some sort of announcement. Equities markets this morning are selling off. I do think that they were expecting some sort of progress, maybe not regarding China, but regarding, an ally or, some sort of announcement that could have came out regarding some sort of deal. And they didn't get that.
Yeah, I heard some news potentially about Japan, on Sunday. But one point of context that I stumbled upon, I think this weekend that I found interesting was in the past, trade deals have taken on average 18 months to negotiate between countries. So, the fact that they're looking to do this in 90 days, obviously an accelerated time frame, but not necessarily something that we would expect news on week to week necessarily at this point. This is probably something that's going to shake out over the next few months.
Yep.
Yeah, I like your point on it essentially becomes an embargo. I was listening to an interview over the weekend with a toy maker that gets most of their parts from China. And they, just making the comment, like at this point, what sense does it make me to try to cut costs in other areas when, this is all I'm focused on is, how can I reduce the impact of tariffs? So it completely changes their incentives for their focus to, if they want to stay in business, they've got to focus completely on tariffs. Otherwise, it does become essentially an embargo. So it's a super interesting dynamic, whether you're making toys or semiconductors or transformers. Interesting dynamic there.
Yep, that's probably the understatement of the year there, Jeff.
Yeah, those numbers are extremely punitive, but for the time being, as of 11 a.m. Monday morning, no news is bad news for the market. We're selling off a little bit. I think what's really kind of on the tip of everyone's tongue right now is Powell and his little spat with the White House, the executive branch in general. This has kind of been, I'd say, the second most important factor kind of impacting the market and the U.S. economy recently. Trump has come into the White House saying he wants lower rates. Some were predicting that these tariffs would lead through to lower rates. They initially did for about 48 hours, and then we saw rates kind of ratchet back up into this, whatever you want to call it, this higher rate environment, this bond vigilantism environment. If there's a lot of finger pointing on who's doing the selling of U.S. Treasuries, but Trump this morning tweeting that Powell needs to cut rates. He's a loser right now because he isn't cutting rates, and I think the markets are taking quite a bit of a step back on those comments just because of it's kind of uncharted territory for the Federal Reserve. Yeah,
I think it's pretty clear that the markets definitely would prefer, Fed independence. Going back to Trump's comments versus Powell's comments, I just think it's too funny. You got to compare the rhetoric, right? So Powell firing shots, he said that what the White House's views are still evolving and their effects on the economy remain highly uncertain. So it's a super formal comment. And then Trump comes in calling Powell a loser. So I just had to comment on that. You got to laugh at the dynamics there.
Yeah, and it's interesting also in the whole context of the Fed being an independent agency, because that's something that's not necessarily been tested legally to sort of the fullest extent. I think everyone's afraid of sort of touching the hot stove. We saw that with the administration sort of stepping back from the abyss with the craziness in the bond market during when the tariffs were incredibly high. And I think there's risk. I've heard it described, or I've seen it reported as the quote unquote moron premium, which don't at me, Jeff, because I didn't coin the term, but there's this concept of, if policymakers are, not necessarily acting in a way the markets perceive as rationally, or if there is a potential erosion of, independence of agencies that are responsible for economic policy like the Fed, then, you could see that be reflective of an increase in the term premium of U.S. Treasuries. One case that I've been following that I think was pretty interesting is, so right now the Supreme Court is currently considering a case about whether the administration has lawfully fired 2 officials from independent federal labor boards. So the reason why this is important is because these labor boards are structured similarly, in which that they're similarly to the Fed, in which that, there is supposed to be kind of a level of independence. Does the executive branch really have authority to do that? Now, they're reviewing that case, so there hasn't been a ruling on that, but the outcome of that case could set a precedent affecting whether the president has the ability to dismiss leaders of other independent agencies, including the Federal Reserve. And now it's important to note also the administration is arguing in that case that they don't think that this precedent would apply for them, firing someone from the Federal Reserve. But we're sort of still in this like uncharted or untested legal territory around whether or not there is really true independence of the Federal Reserve or not.
Kevin, I would agree. I'd absolutely say that we're in uncharted waters right now. I think that the Federal Reserve and the government in general, regardless of branch of the government, have operated throughout the history of the Federal Reserve more in lockstep. They were all on the same page on what kind of economic order they were promoting. And I think this is the first time we've seen in the history of the Federal Reserve that, in this case, the executive branch's ideas for the world economic order are not in line with how the Federal Reserve sees it. The Federal Reserve, maybe more maybe standing in for how markets are seeing things. The markets are still operating by the old playbook, the new playbook. I don't want to say there is a new playbook in effect quite yet, but I think they're trying to write the rules for that playbook right now. So yeah, I absolutely agree. I think we're in uncharted waters, and it's definitely hard to say where this will go from here. Jerome Powell on Wednesday was speaking at the Chicago Economic Forum, and he couched all of his statements very lawyerly. They asked him point blank. They said, if Trump fires you, if he hands you a ticket, says you're fired, what would you do? And he's just said, as the law is stated, he cannot do that. And he kind of declined to comment further on the matter. So
this whole story does come back to what we've been talking about for a couple of months, and one of the theses that Jim has been clinging on to, which is just that one of Trump's main goals overall for the economy is to lower rates, sometimes by any means necessary. I think Trump views that as probably something that would be very popular. Obviously, it would be certainly very popular in our industry. I think all of this is. He is explicitly saying that, so I don't have to think that Trump is telling us that every day that he wants rates lower. So this just reinforces all that.
I think it's important to make the point too that we've got the upcoming Fed meeting on May 7th, right? That's sort of the next test for whether rates will be cut. I think the market has priced in like a third of a chance or so the last time that I checked.
Something like 10%. Right now, June is the first.
Yeah. I did see like more than 50% there.
Yeah.
But I think that, so the point that I was going to make is when the Fed cuts rates, we all need to remember that we're talking about short-term rates. We're not talking about how mortgages are priced. That's, they operate similarly in some ways, but very independently in other ways. And there is a risk where if we cut short-term rates too quickly, that the impact that ends up having is it juices up or increases long-term rates. So it stokes inflationary pressures if we cut short-term rates too quickly, because short-term rates, the goal of raising those is to bring down inflationary pressures. And if we don't have appropriately set short-term rates, given the level of inflation that's out there, then that has a potential to increase inflationary expectations, which ultimately increases longer-term rates, which factor into mortgage rates. So I totally understand why folks in the mortgage industry would be cheering for a Fed rate cut in May. But I think it's important that really what we want them to do is to make the best possible decision based on the data. That's what we're looking for.
Yeah, well said. And tying that back to the beginning, that's why I always look at that 210 spread, right? We look closely at the yield curve to look at those exact expectations. So that was a great explanation again of why that yield curve is so interesting to us as we're thinking about what is the Fed doing with short-term rates and how will that affect long-term rates, inflation expectations, and again, specifically for our industry, ultimately mortgage rates, 30-year rates in particular. So great explanation there, Kevin. Anything else on Powell that we want to hit on?
I was just going to say, one thing that I thought was kind of interesting because there's always historical parallels, I think, to be drawn around where we are now versus, where very similar people were sitting in, this similar seats and trying to evaluate decisions. So I went back and I looked at the last time the federal funds rate was at its current level and there was a rate cut was back in 2007. So it was December 2007. So I was curious, okay, what did the macroeconomic fundamentals look like back then versus today? And could that provide some sort of potential guidance around what the Fed could do or how they might be thinking about things? And I don't think it was so clear cut, but it did the macroeconomic fundamentals looking at core PCE, the unemployment rate, wage growth, and then just what the 10-year Treasury is doing. Macroeconomic indicators are higher now than they were back in December of 2007. So meaning that, core PCE, we're expecting that to come in somewhere in the high twos probably for Q1 2025, but that was 2.1% back in Q4 2007. So inflation was lower back then than it is now. So, meaning that we would expect to see, short-term rates higher to attempt to bring that down farther. The unemployment rate was weaker back then too, meaning that the labor market's tighter now. That's also sort of a, thumbs down in terms of cutting short-term rates. Wage growth was about similar, 4.3 currently versus 4.1, and meaning that again, wage growth, another sort of measure of inflationary pressures. And then the 10-year Treasury yield is also higher today than it was back then, which is also a measure of inflation expectations in the future. So all of those indicators would also support the idea that it's not the right time for the Fed to cut now. Obviously, that's just a sampling of things, but I thought that was interesting, particularly because again, there's always historical parallels that can be drawn that help us better understand how decision making could play out in the current environment versus the last time that happened.
Yep. Yeah, I guess the counter argument is the Fed going to be too slow to react? Are they too slow to react? Are these some of these things starting to weaken enough? Are they looking ahead enough and just not relying on old data, right? The argument that people thought the Fed was too slow to raise interest rates, which is why we got into this inflationary environment to begin with. But I would agree overall. I mean, I think in aggregate, the data says the Fed should be pretty close to where they are, and it's hard to find too strong of an argument that they should be doing like an emergency lowering rates. Certainly,
yeah. No, I think that's a good call out. These are all lagging indicators, right? They're not forward looking projections really, maybe with the exception of like the Treasury sort of. But yeah, this is all kind of like looking backwards as opposed to looking forward. So not necessarily like a full analysis of what everything that they're going to be looking at. But yeah, thought it was interesting to put that together.
Absolutely. And I couldn't say it better than Powell himself, but I would recommend you go listen to his speech from last Wednesday. You can find it on YouTube or the Federal Reserve's website. He's talking, as Jeff said, he's talking about the same things we're talking about on the podcast here: inflation, unemployment, how to balance those two. Notably hawkish during this last interview session. He noted that inflation is on his radar and that the Federal Reserve will respond to, if they're faced with both inflation and unemployment risks, they will address the one that is the most out of line first. Those were his words, which the market interprets is very hawkish, considering that there's currently 3 to 4 rate cuts expected by the market right now. So we definitely have a lot of differences in opinion between the decision makers and the market itself.
And that all leads into, I think, the hardest part about this market right now, whether it's the mortgage industry in particular the broader market, is just the level of uncertainty between all the decision makers, all the data, all the tariff talk, the uncertainty and the volatility. While we did have, slightly less volatile week last week, I don't think anybody feels like it was lacking volatility in a lot of ways. So this uncertainty is, whether it's home builders trying to figure out, the cost of what the cost of labor is now versus what it'll be in 3 months across the market, whether it's borrowers, figuring out where rates will be. This volatility is hammering kind of every part of the market right now.
I think the short of it is business decision makers hate uncertainty, and they will choose to pause making decisions rather than proceed with unknowns. And that goes, so until uncertainty abates, expect the current trajectory to continue.
Yeah, well said.
But did you guys know that there's actually a lot of people on LinkedIn who know exactly what Powell should do, and Twitter as well? I don't know if he's consulting these, the resident experts, but maybe take a look.
Boy, someday the Twitterification of LinkedIn is something I think about a lot lately. So I'm not sure there's much of a difference between Twitter and LinkedIn some days. So
fair point.
All right. Well, let's start looking ahead. What is some of the hard data we have coming out this week, Alex?
It's a relatively quiet week this week, Jeff. It's we have some housing specific numbers. We have new home sales on Wednesday and existing home sales on Thursday. The Fed Beige Book comes out Wednesday as well. That one's kind of a recap of the last Federal Reserve meeting, where again we didn't see any rate cut activity there, but it could sometimes that Beige Book gives us some insights that were overlooked by the market or not picked up on by the market during the last Federal Reserve meeting. And then I think the number one thing to watch out for this week is on Friday, there's a consumer sentiment release for Q1. And that one's really just I think that one's going to have the greatest impact just because everyone right now, outside of unemployment and inflation, is looking at, how tapped out is the U.S. consumer? How much are they front loading these tariffs? Are they buying now with expectations to cut back on spending in Q2 here? Look to Friday for kind of the biggest move from a data release perspective this week.
That's a great way to frame that. It'll be interesting. Well, that was a great episode. I think we did pretty good without Jim. So
I think we did all right.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Kevin.
We still missed you, Jim.
Next week will be a really great episode. We have Kevin Jackson from Wells Fargo that'll be on. He's been on some of our webinars before, and he's got some really great takes on the state of the market. So we'll be interested to hear on what he says next week. So looking forward to that. That's it for today. Join us next week for another episode of Optimal Insights, where we'll continue to provide you with the latest market analyses and insights to help you stay ahead. Don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe to our YouTube channel to access our latest video episodes. You can also find each episode on all major podcast platforms. Thank you for tuning in to Optimal Insights.